She gave 38 years of loyalty, and in return, she got a cardboard box and a closed door. No warning, no gratitude, no place to go. But just when life pushed her to the edge, she stepped onto a piece of land no one wanted and uncovered something that changed everything. Loyalty is often seen as one of the most admirable qualities a person can have. It's something people are taught from a young age, to stay committed, to give their best, to stand by the people and places that depend on them. For many, loyalty isn't just a choice, it becomes a way of life. Margaret lived exactly like that. For 38 years, she showed up to the same workplace, walked through the same doors, sat at the same desk, and gave her time, energy, and attention without hesitation. She didn't just work there. She built her routine, her identity, and a sense of belonging around it. Every early morning, every late evening, every extra task she took on without complaint was her quiet way of proving that she cared. But loyalty, as comforting as it feels, often carries an unspoken expectation that it will be recognized, that it will matter, that it will be returned in some meaningful way. Margaret believed that, even if she never said it out loud. She believed that the years she gave would stand for something when it mattered most. She believed that when the time came, someone would remember her efforts, her sacrifices, the consistency she brought when others came and went. That belief wasn't built on promises. It was built on hope and habit, reinforced day after day as nothing seemed to go wrong. The truth, however, is that systems and institutions don't always operate on the same emotional level as individuals. To Margaret, those 38 years were filled with moments, helping coworkers, solving problems, staying late when no one else would. But to the company, those years slowly blurred into numbers, records, and policies. Over time, the personal became impersonal. What felt like dedication to her became routine to them. And when decisions had to be made, those decisions weren't based on loyalty or history. They were based on efficiency, change, and direction. When she was told she was being replaced, it wasn't just a job she lost. It was the collapse of a belief she had quietly carried for decades. The shock didn't come from the words alone, but from what those words represented. It was the realization that loyalty, no matter how deeply felt, doesn't guarantee security. It doesn't promise protection. It doesn't ensure that someone will stand up for you when circumstances shift. That moment stripped away the illusion that time automatically builds value in the eyes of others. There's a quiet pain in understanding that something you gave so much importance to might not have been valued in the same way by others. It's not loud or dramatic, it's subtle, almost confusing at first. You begin to question things. Did those years matter? Did anyone notice? Was it worth it? Margaret didn't shout or argue when she was let go. She didn't demand explanations or recognition. Instead, she absorbed the moment silently, because sometimes the deepest disappointments don't leave room for immediate reactions. They settle slowly, becoming clearer with time. What makes this reality even more difficult is how common it is. Many people tie their sense of worth to the places they serve for years. They build relationships, routines, and expectations, believing that consistency will eventually be rewarded with stability. And while that does happen in some cases, it's not guaranteed. The world doesn't always work on fairness. Decisions are made for reasons that don't always consider emotional investment. Change happens quickly, and when it does, it often overlooks the quiet contributions that kept things running for years. Margaret's experience reflects a difficult but important truth. Loyalty, on its own, is not a contract. It's a personal value, not a binding agreement with the world. It shapes who you are, how you act, and how you treat others, but it doesn't control how others will treat you in return. That doesn't make loyalty meaningless, but it does mean that its value shouldn't depend entirely on external recognition. When loyalty becomes tied only to expectation, it can lead to deep disappointment when those expectations aren't met. At the same time, her story isn't about rejecting loyalty altogether. It's about understanding its place. Loyalty is powerful when it comes from self-respect, when it aligns with growth, and when it exists alongside awareness. It becomes harmful when it turns into blind attachment, when someone stays in a place not because it supports them, but because they feel obligated by time and habit. Margaret didn't realize how much of herself she had tied to that one place until it was gone. The absence of it forced her to confront a difficult question: who am I without this? That question is uncomfortable, but it can also be transformative. When the thing you relied on disappears, it creates a space you didn't choose but are now forced to face. In that space, there's an opportunity to rebuild your sense of worth in a different way, one that isn't entirely dependent on external validation. Margaret's journey begins with loss, but within that loss is the chance to rediscover independence, resilience, and identity beyond a single role or title. Loyalty, when balanced with self-awareness, becomes a strength rather than a vulnerability. It allows you to give your best without losing sight of your own needs. It helps you commit without becoming trapped. It reminds you that while dedication is admirable, it should never come at the cost of your own stability or sense of self. Margaret's story highlights the moment where that balance was missing and the consequences that followed. Her experience also invites reflection. It asks whether loyalty is being given freely or out of fear of change. It challenges the idea that staying in one place for a long time automatically means progress or security. It suggests that sometimes growth requires stepping outside of what feels familiar, even if that step isn't voluntary at first. The discomfort that follows can lead to unexpected paths that might never have been explored otherwise. There's also a deeper emotional layer to this realization. When loyalty isn't returned, it can feel personal, even when it isn't intended to be. It can feel like rejection, like being overlooked, like not being enough. But in reality, it often says more about the system than the individual. It reflects priorities that are shaped by practicality rather than emotion. Understanding that doesn't erase the pain, but it can help in processing it without turning it inward. Margaret's story shows how a person can give years of their life to something and still find themselves starting over. It's not a failure of character or effort. It's a reminder of how unpredictable life can be. And while that unpredictability can be unsettling, it also holds the potential for change that wasn't planned but becomes meaningful over time. Hitting rock bottom is rarely a dramatic, cinematic moment. It doesn't always come with loud realizations or sudden clarity. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, piece by piece, until one day you look around and realize there's nothing left to hold onto. That's exactly what happened to Margaret. Losing her job wasn't just about losing income. It was the first crack in a life she had carefully built over decades. Then came the loss of her home, the place where her memories lived, the place that once felt safe. Each loss stripped away another layer of certainty, leaving her standing in a reality she never imagined she would face. There's a particular kind of emptiness that comes with losing everything familiar. It's not just physical, it's emotional, mental, almost existential. When Margaret sat on that cold bench at night, clutching her coat as cars passed by, she wasn't just thinking about where she would sleep. She was facing the collapse of her identity. For years, she had known who she was: a reliable worker, a steady presence, someone with a routine and a place in the world. But now, without those roles, she was forced to confront a question many people avoid. What remains when everything you depended on disappears? Rock bottom often forces a level of honesty that comfort never demands. When life is stable, it's easy to move through it without questioning much. You follow patterns, meet expectations, and assume things will continue as they are. But when those patterns break, when stability is taken away, you are left with nothing but the truth of your situation. For Margaret, that truth was harsh. She had no job, no home, no clear direction. And perhaps most difficult of all, no one stepping in to fix it for her. That moment, as painful as it was, carried something hidden within it: freedom. Not the kind of freedom people celebrate, but a raw, unfiltered version. When you have nothing left to lose, the fear that once held you back begins to loosen its grip. The expectations that once guided your decisions no longer apply. The paths you thought you had to follow suddenly disappear, leaving behind a blank space. It's uncomfortable, even terrifying, but it's also a rare kind of opportunity. Margaret didn't see it that way at first. Sitting alone, feeling invisible to the world around her, it didn't feel like an opportunity. It felt like an ending. But sometimes what feels like an ending is simply a transition you didn't choose. The mind takes time to adjust to that idea. It resists it, questions it, even rejects it. But slowly, almost without noticing, something begins to shift. Not in the world around you, but within you. The next morning, when Margaret started walking without a destination, it wasn't because she had a plan. It was because she had no other option. And that's often how turning points begin, not with intention but with movement. Even the smallest step forward taken out of necessity can lead to something unexpected. Her feet carried her to a place she had never paid attention to before, a piece of land others had dismissed, ignored, labeled as unwanted. There's a powerful symbolism in that moment. A person who felt unwanted, standing in a place the world had also rejected. It's almost as if life placed her there intentionally, reflecting her internal state in the environment around her. And yet, instead of turning away, she stayed. Not because she saw potential in it immediately, but because she recognized something familiar. It didn't judge her, didn't push her away, didn't demand anything from her. For the first time since losing everything, she found a space where she could simply exist without pressure. Rock bottom often removes distractions. It takes away the noise, the expectations, the constant demands, and leaves you with a quieter, more honest version of life. In that quiet, something important can happen. You begin to reconnect with yourself in a way that isn't shaped by roles or responsibilities. Margaret, in that empty land, wasn't an employee, a tenant, or a part of a system. She was just herself, trying to get through each day. Survival in its simplest form can be incredibly grounding. Gathering wood, finding water, building a shelter. These tasks are basic, but they bring a sense of purpose that is immediate and real. There's no long-term pressure, no distant expectations, just the focus on the present moment. And in that focus, something begins to rebuild. Not the old life, but a new foundation, one that is created from effort rather than assumption. What's interesting about rock bottom is that it strips away illusions. It removes the belief that stability is permanent, that plans will always work out, that effort guarantees reward. Those illusions, once gone, can feel like a loss, but they also make room for a more realistic understanding of life. Margaret began to see things differently. She wasn't waiting for someone to give her a chance anymore. She wasn't expecting recognition or fairness. She was simply doing what she could with what she had, in the moment she was in. That shift, subtle as it may seem, is powerful. It marks the difference between being stuck in loss and moving through it. When you stop looking backward at what was taken and start engaging with what is in front of you, even if it's difficult, you begin to regain a sense of control. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about taking small, consistent actions that move you forward, even if the direction isn't fully clear. Rock bottom doesn't magically transform into success overnight. It's a slow process filled with uncertainty and effort. There are moments of doubt, moments where the weight of what was lost feels overwhelming. But within that struggle, resilience begins to form. Not the kind that is loud or visible, but the quiet kind that shows up each day, even when it's hard. Margaret didn't suddenly become confident or fearless. She simply kept going, one step at a time. And that's where the real transformation begins, not in the circumstances, but in the mindset. When you realize that you can survive what you once thought would break you, something changes. The fear of failure loses some of its power. The idea of starting over becomes less intimidating. You begin to understand that even in the worst situations, there is still a path forward, even if it's not the one you expected. What started as loss slowly becomes space. Space to think, to act, to rebuild. Space that didn't exist before because it was filled with routines and obligations. In that space, new possibilities can emerge, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer confined by what used to define you. Margaret's journey didn't erase her past, but it gave her a chance to create something beyond it. Rock bottom, in this sense, is not just a point of despair. It's a point of reset. It removes what is no longer sustainable, even if that removal feels painful and unfair. It forces you to confront reality in its rawest form, and in doing so, it opens the door to change that might never have happened otherwise. It's not a place anyone chooses to go, but it's a place where something new can begin to take shape. Quietly, slowly, and often unexpectedly, people are naturally drawn to what looks promising on the surface. Clean paths, popular choices, safe opportunities. These are the things most of us are taught to chase. We learn to look for approval, validation, and signs that something is already valued by others before we consider stepping into it ourselves. It feels safer that way. If something is widely accepted, it must be good. If many people want it, it must be worth pursuing. But this way of thinking often blinds us to something equally important. Value doesn't always come from what is obvious, and opportunity doesn't always appear in attractive forms. Margaret's encounter with that abandoned piece of land reflects this truth in a powerful way. At first glance, there was nothing appealing about it. The ground was uneven, the grass overgrown, the fence broken. The sign hanging loosely, warning people to stay away, was enough to make anyone turn around without a second thought. It had already been labeled by the world as unwanted, and over time, that label became its identity. People passed by it without curiosity, without question, without imagining that it could be anything more than what it seemed. That's often how hidden opportunities exist, in plain sight, covered by assumptions. The label of unwanted is powerful because it shapes perception before experience. When something carries that label, most people don't investigate further. They trust the judgment that has already been made. They move on, looking for something that feels more certain, more accepted, more secure. And in doing so, they miss what might have been a chance to create something meaningful. Margaret, however, was in a different position. She wasn't looking for the best option or the safest path. She wasn't comparing choices or weighing possibilities. She was simply trying to find a place where she could exist. That shift in perspective made all the difference. Because she had nothing to lose, she was open to something others ignored. The very thing that repelled others became, for her, a quiet invitation. There's something deeply symbolic about that moment. A person who feels rejected by the world finds herself standing in a place the world has also rejected. And instead of walking away, she steps in. Not because she sees immediate value, but because she doesn't see rejection anymore. She sees possibility, even if it's unclear. That's the key difference. Opportunity isn't always about recognizing value instantly. Sometimes it's about being willing to explore something that hasn't yet proven itself. Unwanted places, ideas, or situations often carry potential precisely because they've been overlooked. When something is popular or in demand, it's usually already shaped, already defined, already controlled by expectations. But when something is ignored, it remains open. It hasn't been fully explored, fully understood, or fully used. That openness can be intimidating, but it also allows for creativity, for ownership, for transformation. Margaret didn't walk onto that land with a plan to turn it into something valuable. She didn't see a future filled with growth or success. What she saw was a quiet space where she could start again, even if that start was small and uncertain. And that's often how real opportunity begins, not with grand visions, but with simple acceptance. She accepted the land as it was, without expecting it to be something else. And in doing so, she gave herself the chance to discover what it could become. There's an important lesson in that approach. Many people wait for the perfect opportunity, something that looks complete, something that guarantees success. But those opportunities are rare, and when they do appear, they are often already crowded with competition. The overlooked paths, on the other hand, require effort, imagination, and patience. They don't offer immediate rewards, but they offer something else, the chance to build something unique, something that reflects your own effort rather than fitting into someone else's structure. As Margaret spent more time on the land, she began to see it differently. What once looked like emptiness started to reveal small possibilities, a patch of soil that could be cleared, a corner that could provide shelter. Each small step she took began to change not just the land but her perception of it. The more effort she invested, the more potential she uncovered. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. This gradual transformation highlights another truth. Opportunity often reveals itself through action. It's not always visible at the beginning. It becomes clearer as you engage with it, as you invest time and effort into understanding it. If Margaret had judged the land only by its first appearance, she would have missed everything it had to offer. But by stepping into it, by working with it, she allowed its hidden value to emerge. There's also a deeper emotional layer to this idea. When something is labeled as unwanted, it's often dismissed without empathy. It's easier to ignore than to understand. The same happens to people, ideas, and situations. They are overlooked because they don't fit a certain expectation or standard. But within those overlooked spaces, there is often resilience, depth, and untapped potential. Margaret, in many ways, saw herself reflected in that land. And by choosing not to walk away from it, she also chose not to walk away from herself. This connection between perception and reality is powerful. What we consider valuable is often influenced by what others think. But when you step outside of that influence, when you allow yourself to see things differently, you open the door to possibilities that others might never notice. It requires a certain level of courage, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet willingness to trust your own judgment even when it goes against the common view. Margaret's story shows that opportunity doesn't always come in the form we expect. It doesn't always look appealing, and it doesn't always come with clear instructions. Sometimes it appears as something broken, something ignored, something others have given up on. And in those moments, the choice isn't about recognizing immediate value. It's about deciding whether to explore it or walk away. What makes this even more meaningful is that the value she eventually discovered wasn't created out of nothing. It was always there, hidden beneath neglect and misunderstanding. The land didn't change overnight. The perception of it did. And that shift in perception came from someone who was willing to see beyond the surface, to look past the label, and to give it a chance. This idea extends beyond physical spaces. It applies to situations in life, to ideas that seem unconventional, to paths that don't follow the usual pattern. The things that seem uncertain, unpolished, or even undesirable at first can hold unexpected potential. But that potential only becomes real when someone is willing to engage with it, to invest in it, to believe in it enough to give it time. Opportunity in its truest form is not always something you find. It's something you create by choosing to see differently, by choosing to act where others hesitate, and by choosing to stay where others leave. Self-reliance rarely begins as a choice. More often, it begins as a necessity, something that grows in the absence of support rather than in the presence of comfort. Margaret didn't wake up one day and decide she wanted to rely only on herself. Life pushed her into that position when everything familiar was taken away. The job that once gave her structure was gone. The home that once gave her safety was no longer hers. The people and systems she had trusted to provide stability were no longer there. What remained was a quiet, unavoidable truth. If she wanted to move forward, even in the smallest way, she would have to depend on herself. At first, that realization can feel overwhelming. When you've spent years operating within systems that guide your actions, the sudden absence of those systems creates uncertainty. There's no one telling you what to do next, no clear path laid out, no safety net to fall back on. It forces you into unfamiliar territory where every decision, no matter how small, carries weight. For Margaret, even basic choices, where to sit, where to walk, what to do next, became significant because they were no longer part of a routine. They were hers to make, and that responsibility can feel heavy when you're not used to carrying it alone. But within that weight, there is also a quiet shift taking place. The more you begin to rely on your own decisions, the more you start to trust them. It doesn't happen instantly. In the beginning, there is doubt, hesitation, even fear of making the wrong choice. But action, even imperfect action, starts to build something important, confidence rooted in experience rather than assumption. Margaret didn't have a guidebook for survival, but she had her instincts, her ability to observe, to adapt, to try. And with each small success, no matter how minor it seemed, her sense of capability grew. Self-reliance is often misunderstood as independence in its most extreme form, as if it means rejecting help or isolating oneself completely. In reality, it's about developing the ability to stand on your own when necessary. It's about knowing that even in the absence of external support, you can still function, still think, still move forward. Margaret's situation required her to tap into that ability in a very practical way. Gathering materials, building shelter, finding ways to meet her basic needs. These weren't abstract ideas, they were daily realities. And through those realities, she began to see herself differently. There's a certain strength that comes from doing things for yourself, especially when you once believed you couldn't. It changes the way you view challenges. Instead of seeing them as obstacles that require external solutions, you begin to see them as problems you can engage with directly. Margaret didn't solve everything at once. There were struggles, moments of frustration, times when things didn't work the way she hoped. But each attempt, whether successful or not, added to her understanding. And that understanding became a foundation she could build on. One of the most powerful aspects of self-reliance is the shift in mindset it creates. When you rely heavily on external structures, it's easy to feel powerless when those structures fail. You begin to associate your stability with something outside of your control. But when you start relying on yourself, even in small ways, that sense of control begins to return. It's not about controlling everything. It's about knowing that you have the ability to respond, to adapt, to find a way forward even when things don't go as planned. Margaret's journey reflects this shift clearly. In the beginning, she was reacting to loss, to circumstances she didn't choose. But as she began to take action, as she started shaping her environment instead of simply enduring it, her role changed. She was no longer just someone who had lost everything. She became someone who was building something new, even if it was small and fragile at first. That transition, from passive to active, is at the core of self-reliance. There's also a deeper emotional dimension to this process. When you start relying on yourself, you begin to rebuild your sense of worth from within. Instead of measuring your value based on external validation, titles, roles, approval, you begin to see it in your ability to persist, to solve problems, to keep going despite difficulty. Margaret's value was no longer tied to her job or her past. It was reflected in her resilience, in her willingness to continue even when the path was uncertain. This doesn't mean the process is easy or comfortable. Self-reliance often comes with loneliness, especially in the beginning. There's no immediate reassurance, no one to confirm that you're on the right track. You have to sit with uncertainty, make decisions without guarantees, and accept that mistakes are part of the process. But within that discomfort, there is growth. Each challenge you face becomes an opportunity to learn more about your own capabilities. Over time, something subtle but significant begins to change. What once felt like survival starts to feel like progress. The actions that were initially driven by necessity begin to take on meaning. Margaret wasn't just gathering resources anymore. She was creating a space that reflected her effort, her choices, her determination. That space, no matter how simple, became a symbol of what she could do on her own. Self-reliance also brings a different kind of freedom. It's not the freedom of having endless options or complete security, but the freedom of knowing that you are not entirely dependent on circumstances beyond your control. It allows you to move through life with a sense of agency, even in difficult situations. Margaret didn't regain everything she lost right away, but she gained something equally important, the confidence that she could handle whatever came next. There's an important balance within this idea. Self-reliance doesn't mean you never accept help or that you isolate yourself from others. It means you are not defined by your dependence. You can accept support when it's available, but you are not broken without it. Margaret's strength came from learning that she could stand on her own, not because she wanted to be alone, but because she needed to know she could survive if she had to. Her story highlights how strength is often built in moments of difficulty rather than ease. Comfort can make us complacent, while challenge forces us to grow. The skills, mindset, and resilience that Margaret developed didn't come from a stable environment. They came from adapting to instability. And those qualities, once developed, don't disappear. They become part of who you are, shaping the way you approach future challenges. There's also a quiet dignity in self-reliance. It's not loud or attention-seeking. It doesn't need recognition to exist. It shows itself in actions, in persistence, in the ability to keep moving forward without external validation. Margaret didn't need anyone to acknowledge her efforts for them to matter. The fact that she continued, that she built something from nothing, was enough. In the end, self-reliance is not about proving something to the world. It's about discovering something within yourself. It's about realizing that even when everything else falls away, you still have the ability to act, to think, to create a path forward. Margaret's journey didn't eliminate hardship, but it transformed the way she faced it, turning uncertainty into something she could navigate rather than something that controlled her for most of her life. Margaret believed that her worth was something that would naturally be seen and acknowledged by others. It wasn't something she thought about every day, but it was quietly there, shaping how she lived. She showed up on time, worked harder than expected, stayed loyal even when things became difficult. In her mind, all of this meant something, not in a loud or demanding way, but in a quiet understanding that effort, consistency, and dedication would eventually be recognized. That belief is deeply human. People want to feel seen. They want to know that what they do matters, that their presence has value, that their years are not invisible. But the moment she was replaced without hesitation, that belief cracked. Not completely at first, but enough to shake her. It raised a question she had never truly faced before. If no one acknowledges what you've given, does it still have value? That question is uncomfortable because it forces a deeper reflection. It asks whether worth is something given by others or something that exists independently of their approval. For Margaret, the loss of her job wasn't just a financial or physical setback. It challenged the way she understood her own importance. When external validation disappears, it leaves behind a kind of silence. There are no more compliments, no more acknowledgments, no more signs that what you're doing is being noticed. At first, that silence can feel like emptiness, as if something essential is missing. Margaret felt that deeply. The place where she had spent decades no longer needed her, and that absence felt personal. It's easy in those moments to internalize the situation, to believe that being replaced means being less valuable. But that interpretation, while common, is not always accurate. What Margaret began to understand, slowly and without anyone explaining it to her, is that external systems often measure value in limited ways. They look at efficiency, cost, change, and direction. They don't always account for loyalty, care, or the quiet ways someone contributes over time. This doesn't mean those qualities are worthless. It means they are not always visible in the spaces where decisions are made. And when your sense of worth is tied entirely to those spaces, it becomes fragile, dependent on factors you cannot control. As she spent more time alone, away from the structures that once defined her, Margaret started to experience a different kind of awareness. Without the constant feedback of others, she had to rely on her own perception of herself. At first, this felt uncertain. Without someone telling you that you're doing well, it's difficult to know how to measure your progress. But over time, something began to shift. Instead of asking whether others saw her value, she started to notice what she was actually doing. She saw herself building a shelter from almost nothing. She saw herself adapting to conditions she had never faced before. She saw herself continuing day after day, despite exhaustion and uncertainty. These weren't things anyone was praising her for. There was no audience, no recognition, no reward. And yet, they were real. They required effort, patience, and resilience. And in recognizing that, she began to see a form of value that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. This realization doesn't come all at once. It builds gradually through experience. Each time you solve a problem on your own, Each time you persist despite difficulty, each time you make a decision and stand by it, you begin to develop a sense of internal validation. It's quieter than external praise, but it's more stable. It doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's judgment. It comes from knowing what you've done, what you're capable of, and how you've handled situations when things were uncertain. Margaret's transformation wasn't about proving others wrong. It wasn't about going back and demanding recognition from those who had overlooked her. It was about shifting the source of her self-worth. Instead of looking outward, she began to look inward. Instead of asking, "Do they see me?" she began to ask, "Do I see myself clearly?" That change, while subtle, altered everything. It allowed her to move forward without carrying the weight of needing approval. There's a freedom in that shift. When your worth is no longer dependent on external validation, you are less affected by rejection, criticism, or neglect. These things may still hurt, but they don't define you in the same way. They become experiences rather than conclusions about who you are. Margaret didn't stop caring about how she was treated, but she no longer allowed it to determine her entire sense of identity. This doesn't mean external recognition has no value. Appreciation, respect, and acknowledgement are important parts of human interaction. They create connection and reinforce positive behavior. But when they become the sole source of self-worth, they create vulnerability. They make you dependent on something that can change at any moment. Margaret's experience shows what happens when that dependence is suddenly removed. It creates confusion at first, but it also creates an opportunity to build something more stable. As she continued to work on the land to shape it into something livable, her sense of accomplishment grew. Not because anyone was watching, but because she could see the results of her own effort. The shelter she built, the space she cleared, the routines she established, all of these became evidence of her capability. They were tangible reminders that she could create value through action, not just through recognition. This kind of self-generated value is different from what she experienced before. It's not tied to a role or a title. It doesn't depend on being part of a system. It exists because of what she does and how she does it. And because it comes from within, it's less likely to be taken away by external changes. Even if circumstances shift again, the understanding she has developed about herself remains. There's also a deeper emotional impact to this realization. When you stop relying entirely on others for validation, you begin to treat yourself differently. You become more patient with your own progress, more understanding of your own mistakes. Instead of seeking constant approval, you focus on growth. You start to define success in terms that are meaningful to you, rather than terms that are imposed from outside. Margaret's story highlights how difficult experiences can lead to this kind of growth. Losing everything forced her to confront a reality she might never have questioned otherwise. It pushed her to examine where her sense of worth came from and whether it was truly stable. In doing so, it opened the door to a different way of seeing herself, one that was not dependent on being needed by others, but on being capable within herself. By the time her circumstances began to improve, when the land revealed its hidden value and her situation changed, she was no longer the same person who had been dismissed. She didn't return to the mindset of seeking approval from those who had replaced her. Instead, she carried forward the understanding she had developed. Her success was no longer about proving her worth to others. It was about living in alignment with the value she had already recognized within herself. This is what makes her final decision so powerful. When faced with the opportunity to reconnect with those who had once overlooked her, she didn't respond with anger or a desire for validation. She responded with clarity. She knew who she was, what she had built, and what she deserved. And because of that, she didn't need their approval anymore. Her journey shows that true worth is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something that is discovered, shaped, and strengthened through experience. External recognition can support it, but it cannot replace it. When you understand this, you become less dependent on circumstances and more grounded in your own sense of self. Moral, real worth is not defined by how others see you, but by how deeply you understand and believe in yourself. especially when no one else is watching. Disclaimer: this story is fictional and created for emotional, motivational, and entertainment purposes. While it may reflect real-life struggles and themes, any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.